Hey everybody, and welcome to our next lecture on photosynthesis. So we are moving right along in the semester. Hopefully that you guys are getting used to all this kind of stuff. We're gonna get to some of the videos that I recorded last semester. So if I say like, hey, welcome to our first lecture because we're in quarantine, that already happened. So we're just kind of like getting caught up with all the videos and where I was at. So anyway, if you guys have any questions on anything, of course, email me. A lot of you guys have been doing so already. You've been doing a fantastic job. So just make sure to keep up on absolutely everything. And then we're going to have a nice, easy, smooth semester. So good for you guys. All right, let's move along. We're going to be talking about Chapter 7 today, which is photosynthesis. All right, so we're going to be, jumping ahead here. So we're going to be talking about photosynthetic autotrophs. So if you are photosynthetic, you are making your own nutrients with light. If you're an autotroph, you're a self-feeder. Okay, so we're going to learn later in the semester about chemoautotrophs, that's self-feeding with chemicals. But right now we're going to be talking about photoautotrophs, which are self-feeding with light. Okay, so that's what we're going to be talking about today when it talks about photosynthetic organisms. A couple different types of photosynthetic organisms include land plants, which you guys should be pretty familiar with, you know, your grasses, your trees, etc. We also have photosynthetic algae, right? Things that live in the water, either the freshwater or the marine environment. And finally, we also have photosynthetic bacteria. So there are, and we talked about this a little bit when we learned about bacterial cells, we did learn about that some of those little tiny bacterial prokaryotes can actually do photosynthesis. And that's how we got that great oxygenation event, and that's how we got, you know, all sorts of good stuff. That's the reason that we're alive on this planet. So yay for the photosynthetic bacteria. All right, so remember that these plants are still going through cellular respiration and photosynthesis. It's not mutually exclusive. They do both, right? The cellular respiration that we learned about last lecture is them breaking down the sugars and turning it into cellular energy. What we're going to be talking about today is the creation of those sugars that they eventually will break down. Now, we kind of talked about some starches and stuff like that, cellulose and all that kind of stuff, which are structural carbohydrates. So they're complex carbohydrates because they're used for things like structure. Now, plants are basically all cellulose or starch or a combination of the two, which essentially, again, is just those little chains of glucoses and sugars. So to get that structure, to get that, you know, like we're made up of mostly proteins, they're made up of mostly like carbohydrates. So to get that, they actually have to do photosynthesis to be able to grow and build their new cells. Not only that, they also eventually will break some of those sugars down and turn that into usable bits of energy. So they're building sugars to make themselves, their bodies, but they're also using the sugars as a form of energy. So it's really important to remember both of those processes happen in these plants and algae and photosynthetic bacteria. Now, in photosynthesis, there are technically two different steps or two different reactions. There's known as the light reaction or the light dependent reaction, and then the light independent reaction, or the dark reaction is sometimes it's referred to. Now, the first part, the light reaction, happens because that's actually where the light is being absorbed. The sunlight is actually being absorbed into the plant. That's why it's called a light reaction. Now, the light reaction is going to make some products. Those products are going to turn on the light independent reaction, or the dark reaction. Now, it's not that it happens in the dark, and it definitely needs light, because step 1 turns on step 2. Step 2 is actually going to end in the formation of the sugar. So step 1 is going to create things like those ATP molecules. So we actually create energy to then take that energy to create sugar to eventually break the sugar down into usable bits of energy. But remember, we're not just using it for energy, we're also using it for structure. So if the plant just made energy, then it would never grow. It would never become larger. And that's what the plants want to do. They want to become larger. So that's why, again, they're going to do the step 1, the light reaction, right? That's going to actually make ATP and our good friend NADH. Remember those high energy electron carriers? They're going to store those electrons for later use. That later use is actually going to create enough energy to turn on the light independent reaction, which is going to make the sugar. So let's get to that real quick. All right, so remember, we learned last lecture the chemical formula for the cellular respiration equation. I'm blanking. The cellular respiration equation, which is the exact opposite of this equation here. So this is photosynthesis. If you've already learned cellular respiration, this should look pretty familiar. So in this case, we are taking carbon dioxide and water, and adding a little light energy, meaning sunlight energy, to create photosynthesis, which is going to give us glucose and oxygen. Okay, the exact opposite of cellular respiration, which is oxygen, hence the respiration part, plus sugar, gives us 6 H2O, 6 CO2, and ATP. But in this one, it's the other way around. So the energy is actually coming in here to push that reaction forward and actually get photosynthesis going. So that's what it means. That's why it's a little bit different, and that's why the light energy comes in here instead of over here. But it is added to the reaction beforehand to get the reaction going. So really, exact same thing, just backwards of cellular respiration that we've already learned about. Now, where is this all happening? We've kind of learned about the chloroplast already when we were talking about the different types of cells, but now we're actually going to get specific into where the nitty-gritty of this photosynthesis is occurring. So this is our little leaf right here. It has these photosynthetic cells, right? Meaning it has a bunch of chloroplast in each one of its cells. That chloroplast is a green pigment that actually absorbs all these different spectrums of light. Now, it is what makes the leaf green, right? That's all that chloroplast in there. And it is the site of photosynthesis. So specifically, what you can see right here, this is known as the mesophyll of the cell. It's the middle of the cell. The middle of the leaf. And we have all these tiny little cells. Inside each one of these little cells are going to have chloroplasts in them. Okay? Now remember, we do need gas exchange, so we do need to bring that CO2 in. This is actually going to occur down here in what's called the stomata. So the stomata essentially, and it literally means little mouth. So that's kind of how they breathe. So we take in a breath like that. Plants don't have mouths, they have stomata. So they open and close their stomata to let that gas in. In this case, they want things like CO2, and they want to get rid of oxygen. The opposite of us. We want oxygen and get rid of CO2. But this is how they do it in their stomatas. Okay, so that's how they're going to pull in that CO2 that they need for photosynthesis, and that's how they're going to release that oxygen they don't need from photosynthesis. Now, inside each one, so this is a single cell right here, each one of these little green dots is a chloroplast. So inside one of these chloroplasts, you have all of these little stacks. So you can kind of think of it like the chloroplast is like an apartment, right, an apartment building, and each one of these little stacks in here, known as the thylakoids, right, those are kind of each individual apartments. So you have lots of little individual apartments in that big apartment building. Inside that apartment is where photosynthesis is happening. Okay, hopefully that kind of helps you guys remember where we are here inside the cell. Now, this middle part right here, which is known as the stroma, is kind of like the cytoplasm. It's just that interior portion. There's not a lot going on there. It's just kind of a liquidy interior portion. And then this big stack, this big green pancake-looking thing right here, those are actually the thylakoids. So a lot of these things are going to happen in the thylakoid membrane. That's what we mean by thylakoid membrane. It's the green stack. So essentially, it'd be your apartment's walls, I guess. Okay, and that's what you can see right here. And then one of those entire stacks would be considered a grana. So you can think of like almost like that whole floor would be the grana. And then you have individual apartments inside. That would be the thylakoids. Kind of thing like that. Okay. Now, when we talk about light, we're going to be talking about absorbing different wavelengths of light. And light does travel in wavelengths, in meaning literally like a wave, like in the ocean. It travels in wavelengths. So that's what we mean by a wavelength. How much distance is it between each either trough or crest? Doesn't matter. So if you look at this, these are known as the crest. These are known as the troughs. Basically, all you measure is 1 to 1. So either one trough to one trough or one crest to one crest. Same distance, right? Because they go up and then down and then up and then down. So that would be considered a wavelength. Now, these wavelengths are really small, okay? So they're measured in what's called nanometers, which is really, really, really tiny. That's why we really can't see all of them with our naked eye. In fact, we can only see between 380 nanometers and 750 nanometers. Everything else is outside of the range of our eye. We cannot see it. Some organisms can, right? Some organisms can see in UV light and stuff like that. And that's what you can see right here. So even smaller than this violet color, this 380 nanometers, is going to be UV. And then finally going larger, you have things like infrared microwaves, and really big are radio waves. That's why they travel so far. So these are gamma rays, the absolute smallest of the rays, followed by X-rays, UVs. Visible light follows right here in this little spectrum. Finally, infrared microwaves and radio waves. Now, if you see right here, we can actually only see in a very, very small, what's called the visible color spectrum. So that's not a lot. There's a big range out there, all the way from gamma rays to radio waves. Now, these are gamma rays, like, not like it's going to turn you into the Hulk. Gamma rays more like it's going to give you cancer and die. Radiate, so you're not going to become a mutant. You're going to probably die. So all of these can be bad if exposed in too much, especially like x-rays and stuff like that. That's why the doctors hide behind that thing. They say, hey, you're fine, but I'm going to go hide behind this big metal wall. Yeah, because again, too much exposure to all this is bad for your cells. But the visible light is totally fine. Okay, so we did mention briefly how chloroplast is what makes the plant green. And that's because chloroplast is this pigment that is really good at absorbing every single color except green. It actually reflects green. That's why it appears to be green. That's in fact how we see all colors. So this appears blue right now because it's absorbing all the colors except blue. So it's reflecting off the blue. That's kind of the same thing with chloroplast. So it absorbs all the light, right, all the visible light spectrum, but it's not really good at absorbing green. So it reflects off the green. It absorbs all the reds and the yellows and the blues and all that good stuff. Okay, so that's why we can see it as green. Now, here's what's actually happening when these photons of light actually hit the plant. Now, light is traveling from the sun in these little packets of energy called photons. So when it hits the chloroplast, what happens is it actually excites one of its electrons. So inside that little atom, one of the electrons is like, whoa, I'm like super high energy now. Like, I'm excited, right? It raises their energy state. So now it's like one of these like super crazy electrons. It's like, oh my God, I have all this energy, right? That energy is then going to get transferred and turned into usable bits of energy for the cell, which then is going to take all of that energy and make a glucose molecule out of, carbon and oxygen and hydrogen that's just floating around. So it's going to be able to get enough energy to grab those and stick them together. So that energy, again, is always coming from the sun in little packets of photons of light, which are just packets of energy. So it basically travels here. This is that thylakoid membrane again. Inside the thylakoid membrane are chlorophyll. So inside the chloroplast is chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is the color, the light absorbing pigment. Okay, so chlorophyll is what makes the plant green. So we can see right here, this chlorophyll absorbs all the different color spectrums of light except green. It reflects off green, right? And so now we took a normal electron and we raised the energy level, and now it's considered a higher energy state. So this is where it gets that energy. That one little electron is like, oh my God, it's like I just got zapped with all this extra energy, and now I'm going to start running around doing work. Because remember, energy is just the ability to cause work or change. Okay. Now, I do have to mention that chlorophyll is the pigment that makes the plant green, and it is the light-absorbing pigment, but there are different types of chlorophyll. Chlorophyll A is pretty much the one that's really responsible for photosynthesis. So it's like, hey, I'm going to absorb all this light because we're going to turn it into usable bits of energy. Now, chlorophyll B is pretty much indirectly related. It's kind of used as like support. So if it's a bright sunny day and it's totally just like beaming down on you and you're like, all right, you know what, that's like a little bit too much sun. I don't need to do this much photosynthesis. Because remember, photosynthesis uses water. Okay, so if it uses water and you do too much photosynthesis, potentially you could dry yourself out and you could kill yourself. So chlorophyll B is kind of like, all right, I'm going to absorb some of this extra light energy here and we're just going to kind of store it. We're not going to use it for photosynthesis, but we're just kind of like, we're going to help support photosynthesis and we're going to help make sure that we don't burn out as a plant. Yeah, pretty important there. All right, so here again, we're back in the thylakoid membrane. We are inside one of those little chlorophyll pigments. Right? So here's our thylakoid membrane, here's our chlorophyll, here's basically these little pigment molecules. Now when the photon comes and hits these little pigment molecules, they're going to get excited and they're going to transfer energy from one to the next, to the next, to the next, and that's what you can see right here. Boom, 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 boom. It's transferring those electrons, it's transferring the energy from those electrons. And remember, this is kind of what we learned when we were talking about the electron transport chain. You can actually trigger a bunch of different reactions just with these electrons. These high energy electrons can actually trigger all these different reactions to occur. And that's what we can see right here. So this is known as the reaction center because this is where that light is actually going to cause a chemical reaction and start moving photosynthesis forward. Now, carotines or carotenoids are another pigment that is actually used in a plant cell. Now this is actually, I said chlorophyll B does this. This is carotene. Just kidding. Scratch that. Reverse it. Again, we're not really going to be getting super into detail on each one of these individual pigments. You just need to know that there are pigments. So chlorophyll A, directly involved in photosynthesis. Chlorophyll B, kind of like the backup, was like, hey, I'm going to support you, chlorophyll A. I'm going to help you do photosynthesis. Carotenes are those ones that take that extra energy that I was talking about, that absorb that extra energy and are like, whoa, there's just too much energy here. We don't want to burn ourselves out. We don't want to dehydrate. So we're gonna kind of like dissipate that energy and kind of spread that extra energy out so we don't over photosynthesize. Now, these carotenes are also the reason that the leaves change color in the fall. Now, when it gets to wintertime, usually it's cloudier, it's cold, and it's not really efficient for photosynthesis to happen. So that's why these plant cells are like, you know what? We're going to store chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. We're going to put those aside, and we're just going to have our carotenes for right now. And that's actually what, because this carotenes reflects that orange, red, yellow color, unlike the chlorophyll A and B, which are more like the green and the violets and the blues. So these guys are actually going to reflect things like the reds and the orange and the yellow. This is why your leaves change color in the fall, because in the fall you've stored all your chlorophyll for the summertime, and all you have left in the leaves is these carotenes, which are going to give you that nice, big, beautiful autumn color, which is why the leaves change in the fall, because they're basically all just carotenes. That's pretty cool. I always thought that was fantastic when I learned that. I was like, oh, no way, because of carotenes. Weird. All right, and that's what you can see right here. So we have, oh, just kidding, that's not that one. All right. Yeah, again, carotenes, changing of the leaves in the fall. This is the one I was looking for right here. So we can see chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B are the most abundant ones. Again, this is going to be those green colors that are reflected out, the light greens and the dark greens. Now, in the summertime, when photosynthesis is totally prime and it's going well, right, we're going to have that green color reflected, that yellow-green color reflected. All the other ones are going to be absorbed. Now, in the fall, right, when we're getting a little bit too cold to do efficient photosynthesis, we're going to decrease our chlorophyll A and our chlorophyll B concentrations in our leaves. We're going to store them. We're just going to like hang out for a little bit. Okay, the only thing that's going to remain the same is this carotenes, and the carotenes, again, are going to reflect that red and yellow and orange color, which is why we get that beautiful color changes in the fall. All right, so let's get into the nitty-gritty of this. We have to start talking about the steps, and you're like, no, I just learned cellular respiration, it was so hard. I know. But remember, if you learn cellular respiration in really great detail, this is going to be so much easier. So I'm going to kind of breeze through this because we've already learned this in great detail. This is just it in reverse. Okay, so let's start with the photoreaction. Let's start with the light reaction. So what we have right here is step one, the photoreaction. Remember, there's two parts. There's light reaction and the dark reaction, or the light dependent reaction, light independent reaction. You'll hear them both. In fact, we're going to watch a video at the end of this lecture, and they will say, I think he says light and dark reactions. All right, so we are inside the chloroplast. Specifically, we are in the thylakoid membrane. Okay, so inside the leaves is the chloroplast. Inside that is the thylakoid membrane. Inside of those are chlorophyll. Right? The chlorophyll is actually where the light is going to strike, and that's what's going to cause, again, that light, that photon to be absorbed, that energy to be absorbed in the electron. So, with the help of sunlight and water, we are going to bring in, right, inside. Okay, so we have our water, which are already inside of our cell. We need water, right? We absorb it from our roots. We keep it inside of us. We get the sunlight by just putting our leaves outside, and now we actually have the sunlight. So that's where the sunlight and the water come in. Now, in the light-dependent reaction, what we are not making is sugar. We're not making sugar yet. That happens in part 2. We are making ATP and NADH and a little bit of oxygen. Okay, so that's what comes out right here. What comes in? Sunlight and water. It hits the thylakoid membrane. Specifically, it hits the chlorophyll inside the thylakoid membrane. Causes that electron to get excited. Moving all these chemical reactions around, we produce ATP and NADPH. Remember, ATP is energy, NADPH is just that energy carrier. It's carrying that high energy electron. It's like that enzyme that picks it up and takes it where it needs to go and drops it off. Okay, that's NADH. Okay, we also diffuse oxygen out, so this is why plants, when they start to do photosynthesis, produce oxygen. Okay, so that's our first source of oxygen right there. Next up, we're actually going to be going through the electron transport chain. So step 1, in the light reaction, the photon hits the thylakoid membrane, which contains the chlorophyll. The electron gets excited. We produce ATP, NADPH, and oxygen. Okay, now we're going to be going and we're going to be taking that ATP and those high energy electrons that we just made, and we're going to be sending them through the electron transport chain. Where have we seen an electron transport chain before? Cellular respiration. Same thing. Now, instead of the mitochondrial membrane, we're inside the thylakoid membrane. Very similar, very similar. Okay? We're going to go from one to the other to the other. We're going to be moving these electrons down. It's going to trigger this pump. It's going to trigger this pump. It's going to trigger this pump. Wait, we're triggering pumps again to create an artificial gradient. Okay, so again, we're forcing these hydrogen ions from a low concentration to a high concentration. That's that active transportation. It requires ATP, but we just made ATP, so we're okay. Okay, so again, light energy is going to hit this photosystem. I hate to confuse you, but this is actually photosystem 2 is first. Then you go through the electron transport chain. Then you hit photosystem 1. Who named these things? Right? And then once you create that artificial gradient out here, you're going to be able to force these ions through ATP synthase, just like we saw in the mitochondria, which is going to turn and again shoot out ATP. Okay, so we're going to get that ATP, which is going to go start our part 2, our light independent reaction. Okay, it doesn't require light. I mean, it does, because obviously all this energy came from light, and therefore that's going to turn on step 2. So it is kind of misleading. But this one is the only one that directly absorbs the light. So we're going to go over this again. Okay, inside the thylakoid membrane, the light is going to hit the chloroplast. The chloroplast electrons are going to get excited, and they're going to be able to go through and produce the energy required to send the electrons through the electron transport chain. One after the other is going to grab, remember these are just pumps, these are channel proteins, right? They're going to grab these hydrogen ions, they're going to force them through the membrane, creating a higher concentration on this side, right? That's what we want, that artificial gradient, okay? And the light is going to hit the second photosystem. It's going to re-energize those electrons for the second time. Those are going to have enough energy to actually get stored in NADPH, and it's going to go to the Calvin cycle. So we need enough energy to start the Calvin cycle, or part 2, the light independent reaction or the dark reaction. I know 3 names for the same thing. What? Why? Because we're scientists and we like to confuse you. I'm sorry. It's just how it is. So again, this photosystem 2 is going to re-energize these electrons. Now they get carried in the NADPH. They're going to go to the Calvin cycle. We created this artificial gradient here. These hydrogen ions are going to force their way back through ATP synthase, turning it. For every turn, they produce an ATP molecule. All that NADH and that ATP is going to go to the light independent reaction to get that Calvin cycle started. So what we produce at the end of part 1, the light reaction, is NADPH right here, ATP, and oxygen. Right? But this sounds a lot easier because we've already learned all of these processes just happening in the mitochondria. Okay? But now they're happening here in the thylakoid. So to summarize again, we take in light and water in the thylakoid membrane, specifically in the chlorophyll. We are going to produce ATP, NADPH, and oxygen. Right? Pretty straightforward and simple when you look at it like that. Okay. Next up, we are going to take the ATP, NADPH that we just made, and we are going to enter it into the Calvin cycle. Okay, so remember, ADP and NADP, NADP plus, are just temporary carriers. They pick up that phosphate if you're ATP, or you pick up the electrons if you're NADP, right? And then you're taking them where they need to go. In this case, they need to go to the Calvin cycle, okay? It is a cycle. Where have we seen a cycle before? The Krebs cycle. Again, very similar. We're going to put some things in. It's going to turn. It's going to shoot some stuff out. That's what we want. In this case, what it's going to shoot out is sugar. That's the whole point of this. We're trying to make sugar. All right, so here we go. We are taking the ATP and the NADPH that we just made. This energy turns on the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle also takes in more CO2, right? So this is where the CO2 comes in again. So we need to take in that CO2 to combine with our acceptor molecules just like we did in the Krebs cycle. Okay? We're going to turn. In this case, we're going to form some nasty things called rubisco, but we're going to learn about that in the video later, so don't worry about that. But the main part is that we're going to make sugar. So the second part, the Calvin cycle or the light independent reaction or the dark reaction, I know all 3 names, are going to make sugar. This is the point. So the input is CO2, ATP, and NADPH, and the output is sugar. Not that bad when you look at it like this, right? I know. Okay. So remember that we, just like the Krebs cycle, we're going to take things in. We have this little CO2, which is going to get attached to this 3-carbon molecule, kind of like our acceptor molecule. It's going to turn, take in ATP, NADPH. Again, that's the energy. We're breaking bonds, we're making bonds, we're breaking bonds, we're making bonds. Here's where we get the energy to do so. Then we're going to form what's called a G3P sugar. That's what we want. However, we need to turn a couple times to actually get a net G3P sugar, because we make, I think, 6, but we have to keep 5 to keep this going. So really we make 1 for every turn. So again, we're just releasing 1. The rest of them go back in here, get turned into this Rubisco, which is actually pretty nasty stuff. Evolution, not at its finest, because they actually have to deal with this almost toxic poison that they produce themselves. Weird. Right? But then again, more CO2 and turn. We keep turning this, and for every time we do, we produce a glucose molecule or a G3P sugar. So don't need to know absolutely every single step. You just need to know that it takes in ATP, NADPH, and CO2. Turn, forms a little Rubisco, which is a bad thing, but we form the good thing, which is sugar. That's what we want. So just to summarize photosynthesis again, we have inside the thylakoid membrane, we have the light reaction where we take light and water, we produce oxygen, ATP, and NADPH. Then that ATP and NADPH goes into the Calvin cycle with the help of CO2, turns, form things like Rubisco, which is bad, and good things like sugar, right? Remember that sugar is used not only for energy, but it's used for structure. So it's, yes, used for cellular respiration, but it's also used for cellulose and starch. Those are those structural things that we need, those structural carbohydrates that plants literally are made of, and other organic compounds that the plant might need, with the base being sugar. So very, very good things. Thank you, photosynthesis. Okay, so now we're going to just look at a brief overview of how these things are related. Okay, so we had cellular respiration, and now we have photosynthesis. Remember, cellular respiration takes in that sugar, takes in that oxygen, makes water, CO2, and energy, right? Plant cells, when they do photosynthesis, take in water, take in CO2, sunlight, and make sugar and oxygen. It's the same thing happening in reverse. So it's really, really these very mutualistic processes that are just exactly the same and totally interrelated and the same things. We have the Krebs cycle, or the citric acid cycle, when it comes to cellular respiration. We have the Calvin cycle when it comes to photosynthesis. They both have electron transport chains, so they both have those little mechanisms that send electrons, creating that artificial gradient with those hydrogen ions, which creates enough energy with those hydrogen ions trying to get away from each other to force themselves through ATP synthase, which turns it, creating ATP. Okay? So very, very similar processes, just kind of the exact opposite of each other, but mutually working with each other. So it's very, very great. All right, so that was photosynthesis, but we need to talk a little bit more about plants before we move on. Now, when we are talking about certain plants need to regulate how often they keep open their stomata. So if you live in a nice, calm environment that's not super hot, not super cold, you can pretty much have your stomata open all day long, because that's when you're going to be doing photosynthesis. So that's when you're going to need to take in that CO2 and release out that oxygen. Now, if you live in a very hot environment, okay, that's going to maybe be too hot for you and cause a little bit of evaporation in your cells, because remember, you're opening your cells open with the stomata, so the water on the inside potentially could evaporate outwards. That's not a good thing if you need your water. So if you live in a very hot environment, you probably want to keep your stomata closed during the day. So this is the pictures that we can see right here. These are actually electron microscope pictures of an open stomata and a closed stomata. Something that we would have seen in the lab. I'm sorry that if you guys didn't get a chance to, but kind of cool actually. Now, so some examples of the plants that are going to do this. Now, we have some common ivy. Now, these guys are pretty much have their stomata open all day long, which means they're going to be doing photosynthesis all day long, which is very efficient. However, they're going to need water if it gets too hot. So on a nice, calm, cloudy day, or even a mild day, they're probably going to be fine. But if temperatures spike for some reason, these guys could risk drying up and dying. Okay, so really efficient and good at photosynthesis, but if it gets too hot, could be problematic. Now, things like corn usually lives in warmer climates, and therefore they keep their stomata partially open. So it's not completely open, but it is still open enough to do photosynthesis during the day. Now, this requires a little bit more energy because you kind of have to wait on your carbon uptake. So it costs a little bit more energy also. If you're maintaining this opening and closing of the stomata, it's going to cost more energy. So this necessarily isn't the most energy efficient way, but you definitely conserve your water. So things like corn that actually need a lot of water are going to still be able to grow pretty well because they keep their stomata only partially open. So these are known as C3 plants, the normal plants, that are just pretty much doing photosynthesis all day long. These are the C4 plants that kind of break up their carbon intake and their photosynthesis. So they kind of have to like partition out when they're doing both. Requires a little bit more energy, but saves water. Now the CAM plants, these guys live in very hot conditions. They're like, we are never opening our stomata during the daytime because it's 120 out. Right, so their stomata is closed during the daytime. So yes, they absorb that light energy during the day, but they actually have to wait to go through photosynthesis until nighttime. So they're not going to be able to do their gas exchange until night when they open their stomata. So that's what you can see right here. At the nighttime, they're doing their carbon intake. The daytime, their stomata is completely closed. So they definitely, like the C4 plants, but they are like, nope, we don't even do photosynthesis during the day. We just absorb the light, and then we wait for nighttime to do the gas exchange, to do the second part. So they are really not energy efficient at all. In fact, they take the longest to grow. So this requires the most energy, and they're the slowest growing because they're waiting. They're like, well, part one happened now, but we have to wait 12 hours for part two. Right? So very, very not good for growing, but they can survive in conditions where almost no other plants can because they don't run out of water. So these are like your desert plants, like your succulents and stuff like that. So again, this is kind of what we just already talked about. Really great for maintaining water, but requires a little bit more energy again because you have to maintain that open and closing of the stomata or the partial opening of the stomata. So this again would be things like corn. Now here's exactly what that looks like. If we were to take a leaf and just kind of and look directly inside of it, this is what you can see right here. This would be one of the little stomatas, one of those little openings. Okay, the mesophyll cells are just kind of like the middle squishy cells. And these are going to be your xylem and your phloem. These are actually used for water transportation. We're going to learn all about that when we get to vascular plants and non-vascular plants. But these essentially are the reason that plants are able to get so tall, because they can send the water all the way from their roots all the way up to the very, very, very tops of their trees. So really kind of cool. But yeah, these stomata essentially are just openings into the interior of the plant. And therefore all of these cells are bathed in water and containing water. So if you were to open this up and it gets too hot in here, then you're going to start to get that water evaporation. That's why you need to keep it closed during certain parts if it's too hot. These are more just examples of some common C4 plants that you guys might need to know. A lot of the plants that we eat, so like wheat, sugarcane, maize, which is just corn, all those are again just going to be those C4 plants. The CAM plants, again, are going to be things like your cactuses, your succulents, any of your desert plants that need to survive in really hot temperatures, where necessarily they don't get, enough water and therefore must keep their stomata closed during the nighttime and just open them up. Closed in the daytime and just open them up at night so they don't, they maximize the water retention and they don't lose any of it. These are the pathways. We're not going to get super into detail with these, but these again are just kind of how these things are going. It breaks down into 2 different cell types. That's why they're different, and that's why they can kind of compartmentalize when and how they do photosynthesize, because they're working with 2 different cells. Whereas the CAM plant only has the one type of cell and therefore only opens at night because they can't moderate a little bit like this and do one part in one cell and the other part in another cell. So that's just structurally kind of how they're different. Here is a distribution map of things like the CAM plants, the C4 plants. The C3 and the C4 plants. So you can see that mostly what dominates the planet is going to be the C3 plants, where conditions aren't necessarily too extreme. Now what we do see is just above and just below the equator, where the equator actually gets a ton of rain, but just above and below the equator, there's almost no rain. It's really hot. It can be very, very dry, and that's why you see, again, more of these C4 plants, because it's really hot and there's not a ton of water, so water retention for those plants are a lot more important, especially, you can see right here, like the deserts of Africa and stuff like that. Whew, and out in the middle of Australia, super hot. Alright, so now we're going to pause for a real quick video. This is one of my favorite videos because it really kind of solidifies some of these ideas that we have about, like, you should always wear sunscreen. Why you should always wear sunscreen? Yeah. This video is actually going to kind of, I don't know, maybe open your eyes to it, maybe not. I don't know. But we're going to go ahead and watch that real quick. Hope you guys enjoy. So did that blow your mind? Oh my God, the first time I saw it, I was like, I'm sorry. There's hidden skin damage in here that you can't see, and it's all because of the sun. Yeah, so I'm one of the first people who say, I'm terrible at putting on sunscreen. I actually just buy makeup now with sunscreen on it to remember to put sunscreen on. But guys, super, super important to maintain skin health when in the sun. All right, so you kind of learned about different types of UV rays, but we're going to talk about the 3 different types there are. Now, most of you guys have heard of UVA and UVB, but there's actually a UVC. Now, we don't have to worry too much about UVC because of our ozone layer. Thank you, ozone layer. It actually blocks it because the UVC rays are kind of short, right? They don't travel as far and therefore is blocked by the ozone layer. Another really important reason that we need our ozone layer. So things like holes in the ozone layer can cause all sorts of new damages. So the ones we do need to worry about are UVB and UVA. Now, UVB are going to be the longer ones, and these are going to be the ones that are actually causing like the tanning, but also like the sunspots and stuff like that. So the visible skin damage that you can actually see, wrinkles, blotches, stuff like that, that's going to be the aging of the skin. That's all going to be UVB. Thanks, UVB. Now, UVA is much worse. UVA is the longest of all the penetrating wavelengths, and therefore is going to go the deepest. This is actually going to be what's going to cause like skin cancer and stuff like that. So this is seriously like damaging rays. So the superficial damage is going to be the UVB. The deep, deep damage, that's going to be UVA. So really, UVA and UVB, always very important. That's why it's really important to protect against those. That's why you want what's called a broad range sunscreen that covers UVA and UVB. Not just UVB, but it needs to cover UVA too, because that's really the most damaging one. So always get that broad sunscreen, the one that covers UVA and UVB. Okay? Also, you should always get something that's over 30. And now, I know some of you are like, well, I don't really burn, so I just get like the 15. And, any sunscreen is better than nothing. Even an 8, which is ridiculous. There's an 8 and a 4. But you really just 30 is a good place. Really between 30 and 50 is kind of like your perfect spot. Anything over 50, I hate to say it, you're just wasting your money. Because the amount of protection that you're getting is less than 1% more for every one you go up after 50. And we're going to see that in just a second. So you want to get at least 30. You want it to be that broad or broad spectrum or full spectrum to cover those UVA and UVB. And you want it to be water resistant, because notice they don't say waterproof anymore, because it's definitely not waterproof. If you've ever slathered on sunscreen and jumped in the water, it comes right off. So it really, even water resistance is only good for about an hour. So every hour you should reapply sunscreen. And this is why people burn so easily. They put it on in the beginning, they go swimming or run around and you sweat it off and you never reapply. It's very, very important to reapply. Now here's what I mean by sunscreen is better than nothing, but anything over 50 is kind of a waste of your money. So here's SPF 0, and it has 0 protection. Shocking, right? That's just you and your skin in the sun. Now SPF 10 has 90% protection. Just SPF 10. So again, even the 10s and the 15s are better than nothing. You're still getting 90% protection. But there's still that 10% that you're still being exposed to. So when you get to SPF 15, you're already at 93%. That's way better. SPF 30 is at 97%. That's really good. SPF 50 is at 99%. So what about those SPF 75 and SPF 100s? Yeah, what, 99.2%, 99.4%? And they're usually quite expensive. That's just the sunscreen companies trying to rip you off. So really, the 30 to the 50 range is absolutely perfect. You're pretty much set at 30 minimum. But again, any SPF is better than no SPF. So please, please, please go use SPF, guys. It'll save your skin. It'll keep you from getting wrinkles and skin cancer. Right? Not good, guys. Serious, serious stuff. All right, so remember that the UVAs, that's going to be the actual skin cancer, like damaging one. UVB, that's going to be like signs of aging and stuff like that. Now, if you look at a lot of these do cover both UVA and UVB. The best one, however, is the Zinc Oxide. If you've ever used Zinc Oxide sunscreen, it's like you're painting yourself with like paint. Like you come out looking like Casper the Friendly Ghost. You are white and it is thick. You're like, I can't even rub it in. But it's great. It really is. So if you're one of those super fair skinned people who burn, get that Zinc Oxide. Yes, it's really kind of thick and kind of weird and gross, but you will be protected. And, the best one right here. So make sure that you guys get this. All right. with that said, let's go real quickly into the crash course video. Just like we learned about the cellular respiration in crash course, it really does help with his animations and stuff like that. Much better than me just kind of making these little symbols with my hands. So let's watch the crash course video real quick. Thank you, Hank, and we will be right back. Okay, guys, hopefully that really helped you guys kind of solidify the information that we talked about. Really is, again, very similar to cellular respiration, except with things like the producing of the rubisco. So again, make sure that you guys pay attention to stuff like that and rewatch these videos if you need to. It really does help. So thank you guys one more time for another amazing lecture. This is my photosynthesizer. Get it? All right. I'll leave you guys alone. Anyway, thank you so much. Have a wonderful time. I will see you guys next week. And take care and stay safe and enjoy biology.